March 1943. Churchill sat in his war room, studying the latest reports from North Africa with growing frustration. Rommel had just delivered a devastating blow to American forces at Kasserine Pass. 2,000 American casualties, equipment destroyed, units scattered. The American First Army was in chaos, and the British High Command was whispering what Churchill feared most, that American troops couldn't stand up to veteran German forces. The entire North African campaign hung in the balance. Then Eisenhower made a desperate gamble. He called in the one general the British military establishment despised, the one commander considered too aggressive, too reckless, too American, George Patton. Within weeks, everything changed. The demoralized American forces transformed into an attacking juggernaut. Rommel's Africa Corps began retreating, and Churchill, who had serious doubts about this brash American general, found himself saying words he never expected to say. This is the story of how Patton saved the North African campaign and what Britain's greatest wartime leader said when he realized what he was witnessing. February 1943. The Battle of Kasserine Pass represented the worst American military defeat in North Africa and threatened to derail the entire Allied campaign against Rommel's Africa Corps. German forces led by Rommel himself exploited weaknesses in American defensive positions and inexperienced leadership to deliver a crushing blow. American forces retreated in disorder, leaving behind destroyed equipment, supplies, and shattered confidence. Churchill received the reports with deep concern. The Americans had been in North Africa for only 3 months since Operation Torch, and already their combat effectiveness was being questioned. British military observers reported American troops abandoning positions, poor coordination between units, inadequate reconnaissance, and leadership that seemed overwhelmed by the speed and violence of German armored warfare. The British Eighth Army, veterans of years fighting Rommel, had finally learned how to counter German tactics. Now the Americans, fresh and untested, were threatening to create a weak point in Allied lines that Rommel could exploit. The political implications worried Churchill even more than the military ones. The alliance with America was essential to winning the war, but British confidence in American military capability was shaken. Churchill faced pressure from his own military staff to place American forces under British operational control, to essentially sideline American commanders until their troops gained experience. Such a move would humiliate the Americans and potentially damage the alliance at a critical moment. Churchill's private secretary recorded the Prime Minister's mood after receiving the Kasserine reports as deeply troubled. Britain needed American industrial might, American resources, American manpower. But did American forces have the fighting quality to stand against Wehrmacht veterans? Churchill knew that perceptions of American combat effectiveness formed in these early battles would affect Allied strategy for the entire war. If American forces couldn't hold against German attacks, Churchill would face immense pressure to limit American operational independence and keep them in supporting roles. Then Eisenhower acted. He relieved the American commander in Tunisia and made an appointment that shocked the British military establishment. George Patton would take command of the demoralized American forces. Churchill's initial reaction, confided to his military chief, General Brooke, was skeptical at best. Patton had a reputation as a theatrical showman, aggressive to the point of recklessness. This was exactly the wrong moment for American heroics. What American forces needed was careful rebuilding, methodical training, cautious operations under experienced supervision. Instead, Eisenhower was sending them the most aggressive, controversial general in the American army. Churchill knew of Patton primarily through British military intelligence reports and observations from the Sicily planning meetings. The picture they painted was of a general who was undeniably aggressive and confident, but also potentially dangerous. Patton believed in rapid offensive action, in taking risks, in bold armored thrusts. These were precisely the tactics that had gotten inexperienced American forces into trouble at Kasserine. What made Eisenhower think more aggressiveness was the solution? British General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied ground forces in North Africa, shared Churchill's concerns. Alexander sent a private message to Churchill, describing Patton as capable, but noting that American forces needed rebuilding, not another offensive-minded commander pushing them beyond their capabilities. Alexander suggested that Patton's appointment might be Eisenhower's attempt to restore American morale through a dramatic leadership change, but that what was really needed was time, training, and careful operations. Churchill also heard from Montgomery, whose Eighth Army was pushing Rommel from the east. Montgomery's assessment of Patton was dismissive. Montgomery believed the Americans needed to learn proper military methods from British experience, not charge ahead with undisciplined aggression. Montgomery predicted that Patton would either achieve nothing significant or would suffer another embarrassing defeat that would further damage American credibility. The Prime Minister's doubts extended beyond Patton personally to questions about American military culture itself. British forces had learned through years of hard fighting that modern warfare required careful planning, coordination, and methodical execution. American forces seemed to believe they could substitute enthusiasm and material superiority to tactical sophistication. Patton embodied this American approach, and Churchill worried that his appointment would reinforce exactly the attitudes that had led to Kasserine. Yet Churchill also recognized political realities. Britain needed America, needed American resources and manpower, needed to maintain the alliance. If Eisenhower believed Patton was the right choice, Churchill couldn't openly oppose it without damaging Allied unity. So Churchill adopted a position of public support while privately expressing reservations. He would wait to see what Patton accomplished, hoping at best for modest success that would restore some American confidence without creating new disasters. March 1943. Within days of Patton's arrival in North Africa, Churchill began receiving reports that surprised him. Patton had immediately imposed strict discipline on American forces, addressing the slovenly appearance and casual attitudes that British observers had criticized. Patton personally appeared at forward positions, highly visible in his distinctive uniform and polished helmet, demonstrating to demoralized troops that their commander was not afraid to be where the fighting was. But the real transformation went deeper than appearance and morale. Patton reorganized American tactical dispositions, improving defensive positions and ensuring units had proper communication and coordination. He conducted aggressive reconnaissance to locate German positions and weaknesses. Most significantly, Patton shifted American forces from a defensive, reactive posture to an aggressive, offensive mindset. American units began conducting raids and probing attacks, keeping German forces off balance rather than waiting to be attacked. Churchill received a report from Alexander in late March that acknowledged significant improvement in American combat effectiveness. American forces under Patton were demonstrating better tactical coordination, more aggressive patrolling, and improved response to German attacks. Alexander noted with surprise that Patton seemed to have instilled offensive spirit without sacrificing the defensive solidity that American forces had lacked at Kasserine. Then came the Battle of El Guitar.
Patton's forces not only held against a major German armored attack, but counterattacked successfully, inflicting significant casualties on veteran German units. Churchill read the battle reports with growing interest. American forces had stood their ground against Rommel's tanks, used artillery effectively, and then pursued the retreating Germans. This was not the panicked, disorganized force that had fled at Kasserine. This was a competent, aggressive army that had beaten German veterans in direct combat. Montgomery's Eighth Army, advancing from the east, began encountering German forces that had been weakened and disrupted by fighting Patton's forces. Montgomery, never generous with praise for others, acknowledged in a message to Churchill that American forces were performing better than expected and were contributing meaningfully to the overall campaign. Coming from Montgomery, this grudging acknowledgment was significant. Churchill began to revise his assessment. Patton had not created new disasters. Instead, he had transformed demoralized American forces into an effective fighting organization in a matter of weeks. The question now was whether this represented a temporary improvement or a fundamental shift in American combat capability. April 1943. Churchill was preparing for a visit to North Africa to meet with Allied commanders and assess the campaign's progress. Before departing, he reviewed intelligence summaries that painted a clear picture. American forces under Patton had become a legitimate fighting force. They were advancing aggressively, coordinating effectively with British forces, and demonstrating the tactical competence that had been absent at Kasserine. Churchill's private secretary recorded a conversation in which the Prime Minister acknowledged his earlier doubts about Patton had been wrong. Churchill noted that Patton had accomplished exactly what was needed, restoring American combat effectiveness and confidence while avoiding the reckless operations that Churchill had feared. Patton's aggressiveness had been channeled into effective military action rather than wasteful heroics. During his North Africa visit, Churchill met with Eisenhower and requested a meeting with Patton. The meeting was brief but significant. Churchill asked Patton directly about the transformation of American forces. Patton's response, recorded in his diary, was characteristically blunt. American soldiers were as good as any in the world. They had simply needed leadership that believed in them and demanded excellence. Churchill, according to witnesses, listened thoughtfully and then said something that surprised everyone present. Churchill told Patton that he had doubted whether American forces could stand against Wehrmacht veterans, but that Patton had proven those doubts wrong. Churchill acknowledged that the British military establishment had underestimated both American soldiers and American leadership. Then Churchill said words that Patton recorded with obvious pride, that Patton had saved the North African campaign from potential disaster and had proven that American forces would be full partners in the defeat of Germany. This was extraordinary coming from Churchill. The Prime Minister rarely gave such direct praise, especially to commanders he had initially doubted. But Churchill recognized that Patton's achievement went beyond tactical victories. Patton had validated the entire American military contribution to the war at a moment when that contribution was being questioned. Churchill's post-war writings reveal his final assessment of Patton's role in North Africa. In his History of the Second World War, Churchill devoted significant attention to the transformation of American forces after Kasserine Pass, acknowledging that Patton's leadership had been decisive in that transformation. Churchill wrote that Patton represented a distinctly American approach to warfare, aggressive, confident, willing to take risks, and effective when properly applied. Churchill contrasted this with British military methods, which emphasized careful planning and methodical execution. Both approaches had value, Churchill argued, and the combination of American aggressiveness and British experience created a formidable alliance. More privately, Churchill told associates after the war that Patton had been the right commander at the right moment for American forces in North Africa. A more cautious commander might have rebuilt American capability more slowly and carefully, but Patton's aggressive approach had restored American combat effectiveness quickly when speed was essential. Churchill acknowledged that his initial doubts about Patton reflected British skepticism about American military methods generally, and that Patton had proven those methods could be devastatingly effective. Churchill also recognized the broader significance of what happened in North Africa. American forces had suffered a major defeat, recovered under aggressive leadership, and then contributed significantly to defeating Rommel's Afrika Korps. This pattern would repeat throughout the war, American forces learning quickly from setbacks and emerging as increasingly effective fighting organizations.
Patton, Churchill concluded, had been instrumental in establishing that pattern. In a 1949 speech, Churchill was asked about the greatest surprises of the war. Among them, Churchill mentioned discovering that American forces, when properly led, were among the finest fighting troops he had ever seen. Churchill specifically cited Patton's transformation of American forces in North Africa as the moment when he realized that American military capability would be decisive in winning the war. Churchill's lasting verdict on Patton, a difficult, controversial commander whose aggressive leadership achieved results that more conventional approaches could not have matched. Patton had saved the North African campaign, validated American military contribution, and proven that the Allied partnership would be one of equals. For Churchill, who initially doubted Patton, this was high praise indeed. If you're interested in more stories about how Patton's bold leadership shaped World War II, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future episodes from Echoes of Patton.